Hello everybody and welcome to our studies in GCSE history. This is the third of the conflict and tension modules, and some of you will be doing this particular module. This refers to the conflict and tension between East and West, a period of history that we're going to be studying from the end of the Second World War in 1945 to the end of the Cold War, or at least the easing of tensions in the Cold War towards the end of the 1970s. This is a period of study that we are going to be examining in terms of the relationship between the Western world, the capitalist Western world of Great Britain, the United States, the rest of NATO, the rest of Europe, and the Eastern world, the world of communism, the world of the Soviet Union, the world of the Warsaw Pact. And essentially, like I've said just a second ago, this is the third of the conflict and tensions modules. Some students will do the first conflict and tension module, which involves a study of the First World War. Some people do the second conflict and tension module, which is the study of the interwar period, so sort of the end of the First World War going up to the start of World War II. And then some people study this one in terms of the Cold War. Presumably, if you're watching this video, you are studying the Cold War for your GCSE history module, which is why we are here today. This lesson is going to take an introduction to the Cold War for GCSE history. Now, we're going to begin by talking about ideological principles. Essentially, the Cold War is a period of history that we define as such because it was a period where the two major powers were in constant competition with each other, but never actually formally declared war on each other. Hence why it's called a Cold War. It's not hot at all. There's no heat. Now this isn't necessarily to suggest that there was no wars whatsoever, because rather than the United States and the Soviet Union fighting each other, they instead decided to fund other people and to get involved in other conflicts where they were fighting each other, where they were fighting other people, and under the support of others. So, for example, Communist China and the Soviet Union supported the Viet Cong during the Vietnam War, which of course is one that was fought with the United States. Equally, the United States funded the Mujahideen in the 1970s when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. So those are examples of wars that take place that aren't necessarily wars, however, between the major powers, okay? Sometimes known here as the Big Three being the three main leaders at the end of the Second World War. Pictured here at the top of the screen, you've got Winston Churchill of Great Britain, you've got Roosevelt of the United States, and then you have Stalin of the Soviet Union. So that's what this period essentially represents. It's a representation of a conflict that existed between two major sides, between the United States and the Soviet Union. And it begins by this examination of ideological principles, okay? Not only were they competing with each other for who would reign supreme, but they also competed in terms of their ideologies, okay? So the first ideology comes from the West. It comes from the United States and then Great Britain and all of those different parts of the world. And this is the ideology known as capitalism. The USA and Great Britain were the leading capitalist countries during the Second World War. Essentially, what capitalism is, as a very basic and brief overview for those of you who are not studying economics, is it's a type of economic system which is centered around the idea of liberalism. So essentially, the idea here is that individuals are free to make their own decisions, and that these decisions are made within a market which is free, a market which is not controlled by the government, where there is free and fair competition. The government doesn't get involved in the economy in any meaningful way, and this is also included with the idea of free and fair elections and basic principles of democracy. Now, This isn't exactly what capitalism requires. You can have capitalism without democracy. You can have things that aren't capitalist with democracy. But generally speaking, when we think about the Cold War, and when we think about what the Cold War represented, one of the things it represented was a division between democracy on the one hand, which was represented by these capitalist countries, and dictatorship on the other hand, which was represented by the Soviet Union and Maoist China and Vietnam, etc., etc. So this is one of the ideological principles, capitalism. The other ideological principle is known as communism. Now, the theoretical basis of communism was based on the work of Karl Marx. According to Marxist ideology, what capitalism did was lead to the exploitation of a particular class of individuals. This class was defined by Marx as the proletariat. Now, essentially, this just means the worker class, people who would work, the working classes, okay? And they would be exploited by a different class, the bourgeois. And what the bourgeois did was they were the owners, okay? They were the owner class. They owned the means of production. So they owned the factories, and essentially what they did was, and what happens under capitalism, is that the people who work in those factories, the labor that they use, the labor that they put into making whatever it is they make in the factory, is exploited for profit by these owner class, by the bourgeois. And according to Karl Marx, this is a significant injustice. It leads to all kinds of ideas, such as the alienation from one's labor and all such things. And essentially, communism is seen as an alternative to this system. And in terms of the actual practical application of communism, this begins in 1917, at least in Russia, with the establishment of the communist state. Lenin and the idea of Leninism was an authoritative and established dictatorship. So there wasn't elections necessarily, there was dictatorial behavior where one leader was the supreme person in control and command, and this kind of dictatorial behavior would be strengthened under the reign of Joseph Stalin, who took power towards the end of the 1920s. What Stalin did was make a number of economic reforms. These included things like the 5-year plans, which were industrial reforms, and then he made a number of reforms to farming. This became known as collectivization. Again, for those of you who decide to go on to study the history at A-level, you might find yourself studying the Soviet Union, and you might find yourselves examining these things in more detail. But that's a basic overview, okay? Communism stands in contrast to capitalism, essentially the type of communism that was essentially practiced by the Soviet Union was one of a state communism where the state would basically be involved in the market quite authoritatively, and they would there would not be a free market. There would not be freedom in terms of elections. It would be under the reign of a dictatorship. The dictator, of course, here being Joseph Stalin. This was essentially what happened and what existed prior to the Second World War, sorry. So World War II then happens, and what we see in World War II is that there is a certain quite uncomfortable alliance between these two basic ideas. Russia, the Soviet Union, Great Britain and America were all on the same side in fighting against fascism, fighting against fascist Italy and Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. And so there was a lot of camaraderie, seemingly, between the big three. The big three, of course, being these three individuals here, Winston Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin. Now, essentially, when it came to the end of the Second World War, and towards the end of the Second World War, there were a number of conferences between these three and between others from Great Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union to basically decide what would happen after the end of the Second World War. What would the world look like after a war so horrific and so destructive? Well, according to Joseph Stalin, he wanted to see that the USSR, the Soviet Union, or the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, is the name of the abbreviation. They wanted to see that they had great influence over the other countries in Eastern Europe, so countries like Czechoslovakia, countries like Romania, countries like Poland. Now, Stalin also wanted to keep Germany very, very weak in order to eventually turn it into a communist state. It seemed like it was the case that what Stalin wanted was to spread communism around the world. And so he wanted to keep Germany weak, partially because Germany had invaded or had gone to war with Russia twice in the 20th century already, and invaded the Soviet Union in 1941. But he also seemingly wanted to spread communism across Europe. Roosevelt, however, on the other hand, of course, was the President of the United States, and he was optimistic about the views of Stalin when it came to the idea of cooperation. He was convinced that Stalin shared a similar set of values and ideas as the rest of the big three when it came to the way in which Europe would look after the end of the Second World War. So Roosevelt was a lot more positive towards Joseph Stalin. This is somebody who was a lot more positive as a president, but we will then see not long afterwards that the president that replaces Roosevelt, Truman, is a lot more skeptical of Stalin, and a lot more skeptical of the Soviet Union, which is really where we start to see the beginnings of the Cold War start to take shape. Churchill believed that Stalin was intent on expanding the USSR across Europe. In fact, in 1944, he had wrote, 1944 being before the end of the Second World War, he had written to his Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden, who would eventually become Prime Minister in the future, quote, "I have tried in every way to put myself in sympathy with these communist leaders. I cannot feel the slightest trust or confidence in them. Force and facts are their only realities." So Churchill was also particularly apprehensive. He was very apprehensive towards Stalin. He was very apprehensive towards the idea of cooperation with Russia, with the Soviet Union. And Churchill wanted to protect British interests. He wanted to protect British interests in both Europe as well as the Balkans. Don't forget, the British Empire still existed at this time. So Great Britain still controlled a lot of territory around the world. As a result of which, when he and Stalin met in Moscow to conclude a percentage agreement, we start to see Great Britain trying to impose its own obligations, imposing its own interests over the post-war settlement. Now, the next couple of lessons are going to actually start to think about what the end of the Second World War looked like and what the world was going to look like after the end of the Second World War, with the two major conferences being the Yalta Conference and the conference at Potsdam. Now, at the end of every single lesson, I'm going to show you this page here. This is a bibliography. A bibliography is essentially just a list of resources and sources that I've used to put these lessons together. So the citations is the sources that I have mainly been using, and then the further reading are extra bits of information that you might want to have a look at if you wanted to go into a little bit more detail, go into more in-depth if you were really feeling about getting those real top grades for your GCSEs, or if you are thinking about going into doing this at A-level in the future, maybe you want to have a look at this further reading as well. So all of those resources are listed here at the end of every single lesson.